The article ran on a Thursday morning in October 1974, on page 7 of the San Francisco Chronicle, under a headline that someone in the editorial department had apparently considered balanced and that Harry Callahan, reading it over his first coffee in the precinct break room, considered neither accurate nor particularly interesting. The headline read, "SFPD Detectives' Methods Draw Scrutiny, Civil Rights Groups Demand Accountability." The article was 4 columns wide and ran 11 paragraphs, and it had been written by a reporter named David Marsh who had spent 3 weeks building it from a combination of public records, anonymous sources inside the department, and statements from 2 attorneys whose clients had been arrested by Harry and who had considerable professional motivation to characterize those arrests in terms that served their clients' interests. Harry read it once, front to back, set it down beside his coffee, and returned to the case file he had been working through when the paper arrived. He did not read it again. He did not discuss it with anyone in the precinct, not because the article had shaken him in any way he needed to manage privately, but because discussing it would have required treating it as something worth discussing, and Harry had made a clear-eyed assessment of what the article contained and concluded that it did not meet that threshold. The article was not wrong about the facts it presented. The facts it presented were accurate as far as they went. The problem, and it was a problem that Harry understood completely and David Marsh had not understood at all, was that the facts it presented were approximately 30% of the relevant facts, selected from the available universe of relevant facts in a way that produced a portrait of Harry Callahan that was technically supportable and fundamentally misleading, and that the word dangerous in the headline was accurate in exactly the same way. True as far as it went, and not going anywhere near far enough. David Marsh had been a Chronicle reporter for 6 years when he wrote the article, and he was not a bad journalist in the sense of being careless with facts or deliberately dishonest in his presentation of them. He was something more common and in some ways more problematic than a dishonest journalist. He was an honest journalist with an incomplete picture, working within the institutional framework of a newspaper that had, for legitimate and important reasons, been covering the civil rights dimensions of policing in San Francisco with increasing intensity throughout the early 1970s. The framework was real. The civil rights concerns were real. The pattern of police conduct that the Chronicle and other publications had been documenting was real, and the documentation of it was genuinely important journalism that had contributed to genuine reforms in how the department operated. None of this was in question. What was in question, or rather, what was not in question because it was not present in the article at all, was how Harry Callahan fit into that framework, which was to say he did not fit into it in the way the article implied, and the implication was the problem. The article framed Harry as an example of a broader pattern of unchecked police aggression that civil rights organizations were correctly pushing back against. It had the right framework. It had the wrong example. And the reason it had the wrong example was that understanding why Harry was the wrong example required a kind of contextual knowledge that David Marsh did not have, that the anonymous sources inside the department who had contributed to the article had not provided, and that the public record from which the article was partially built was structurally incapable of containing, because the public record documented Harry's methods and was silent about his outcomes for exactly the reasons that the outcomes were real and the methods were occasionally excessive, and the relationship between the two was the entire story that the article never told. Captain Donnelly read the article at his desk, at roughly the same time Harry was reading it in the break room, and his reaction was considerably more energetic than Harry's. He called the Chronicle's city desk and was told that the reporter was available if he wanted to provide an on-record response. He called the city attorney's office and was told, in the specific carefully worded way of lawyers managing liability, that the department should neither confirm nor deny specific details and should under no circumstances provide background information that could be used to contextualize Harry's methods in ways that amounted to endorsing them. He called the chief's office and was told that the chief was aware of the article and would be addressing it through official communications channels and that Donnelly should stand by. Then he put the phone down and sat at his window for 7 minutes, which was 3 minutes less than usual for conversations of this kind, and then he did something that surprised his secretary. He picked up the phone again, called the break room, and told whoever answered to let Harry know there was no required response on his end. The message, when it reached Harry, was received with the same flat equanimity as everything else the department communicated through official channels, which was to say it was noted and then set aside in favor of the case file that was currently more pressing. Harry did not call Donnelly. Harry did not call the Chronicle. Harry did not speak to any journalist about the article, before its publication or after. He continued working. The article existed. The article would exist regardless of what Harry said about it. What existed alongside the article, the actual texture of what Harry Callahan was and what he did and what the city received from his doing it, existed regardless of what the article said about it. These were two separate and parallel realities, and only one of them was going to be visible in the public record, and Harry had long since made his peace with which one it was going to be. The civil rights attorneys who had provided statements to David Marsh were doing exactly what civil rights attorneys were supposed to do, and Harry understood this with the same clear-eyed acceptance that organized his understanding of every other institutional dynamic he operated within. Their clients had been arrested by Harry in circumstances that the arrest reports described in a way that supported the arrests and did not describe in a way that explained the full context of the situations that had made the arrests necessary. This was not deceptive on Harry's part, his reports were accurate in what they contained. They were simply, as all his reports were, stripped of the operational context that had led to the force levels used, because that operational context was not always something Harry could describe in a report without creating documentation of methods that would generate reviews he had no interest in navigating. The attorneys had taken these stripped reports and built from them, with complete professional legitimacy, a picture of unexplained force levels applied by a detective whose paperwork consistently omitted the justifying context. From their perspective, and from the perspective of anyone reading only what the public record contained, this picture was reasonable. From the perspective of anyone who had been present in the situations the reports described, the picture was a photograph of a building taken from an angle that showed no doors and no windows and led the viewer to conclude the building had no openings. The building had openings. Harry had been using them for 26 years. They simply did not appear in the official photography. What the article described as dangerous was Harry's pattern of using force at levels that the official guidelines did not authorize in the specific documented circumstances of his arrests, which was accurate, and his pattern of producing arrest reports that did not contain adequate justification for those force levels, which was also accurate. And his pattern of doing both of these things repeatedly over a career that had generated a significant volume of formal complaints from defense attorneys without producing any successful disciplinary action, which was accurate. And the implication of all three of these accurate things taken together was that Harry Callahan was an officer who used excessive force because he could, because the department protected him from accountability, because the official machinery had failed to impose the consequences that should have followed from his conduct. This implication was the part that was wrong. Not about the excessive force, the force was sometimes excessive by the standards the guidelines established. Not about the department's protection, the department had protected him, for the reasons that have been extensively documented in the complicated institutional relationship between Harry's methods and Harry's outcomes. The part that was wrong was the implication of causation and character. The implication that Harry used force at unauthorized levels because he had no regard for the law or for the people he was authorized to apply force to, that the unauthorized force was an expression of the same basic indifference to civil rights that the broader pattern the article was documenting had correctly identified as a genuine problem in the department. This was the category error. This was where the accurate facts assembled into an inaccurate portrait. Harry's unauthorized force levels were not an expression of indifference. They were the opposite, an expression of the specific and sometimes agonized calculus of a man who had concluded, in each individual situation, that the outcome for the people involved required a level of intervention that the official guidelines did not authorize and that the time available did not allow the official process to authorize in time to matter. The force was sometimes excessive. The excess was in service of protection, not indifference. The distinction was the entire moral substance of the story the article had failed to tell. David Marsh, to his credit, had sought comment from the department before publication, had given Donnelly's office a week to respond, and had published the article with a paragraph noting that the department had declined to provide specific information about Detective Callahan's cases. This paragraph was accurate. What it could not contain. Because it could not contain things that hadn't been told to it, was any understanding of why the department had declined, which was not because the department had nothing to say in Harry's defense but because saying it would have required officially endorsing methods that the department's own guidelines classified as unauthorized, which was an endorsement with consequences that nobody in the official chain had the appetite to absorb. The department's silence was not an admission. It was the specific silence of an institution that had been placed in the position of either defending the indefensible by its own official standards or accepting a false portrait in the public record rather than the true one, and had chosen the false portrait because the true one required too much explaining and because the explaining would have required confronting, in public and on the record, exactly the institutional arrangement that everyone had spent 26 years carefully not confronting. Donnelly had understood this in his 7 minutes at the window. He had communicated it to Harry in the message that said Harry had no required response. Harry had understood it from the message. All of them had lived inside this arrangement for long enough that its specific logic was as familiar as the furniture, and the article was simply the most public manifestation of a dynamic that had been operating continuously in the background of Harry's career for as long as anyone had been paying attention. The letters to the editor that ran in the Chronicle over the following week were, in aggregate, a reasonably accurate sampling of how San Francisco related to the portrait the article had drawn. Several supported the article's framing, letters from civil rights advocates, from defense attorneys, from people who had had their own difficult encounters with police and who found in the article a validation of their experience of a department that protected its own regardless of conduct. Several pushed back, letters from people who lived in the neighborhoods where Harry had worked, from business owners who had watched him operate and who wrote in with the specific frustration of people who understood that the article's portrait was missing something crucial but who lacked the specific knowledge to name precisely what it was missing. A few were somewhere in the middle, acknowledging the legitimate concerns about accountability while noting that the specific cases cited in the article seemed to have produced outcomes that were hard to argue with. None of the letters contained the full picture, because none of the people writing them had access to the full picture, because the full picture was distributed across the department's official files and Harry's private accounting and the memories of the people who had been present in the situations the article described and the territory of outcomes that existed in the negative space of what hadn't happened on the streets Harry patrolled. David Marsh read the letters. He wrote a follow-up piece 2 weeks later that was somewhat more nuanced than the original, acknowledging in 2 paragraphs that Detective Callahan's career had also produced a significant number of successful arrests and convictions, which was the closest the public record ever got to telling the other half of the story without actually telling it. Harry did not read the follow-up. He was in the middle of a case. The case required his attention. The case was, as cases always were, the thing that actually mattered, and the thing that actually mattered was where Harry's attention went when it had to choose. The article and the follow-up and the letters and Donnelly's 7 minutes at the window and the city attorney's carefully worded advice all existed in a territory that was real and consequential in its own terms. In the terms of institutional reputation and civil liability and the department's public standing and the broader political conversation about policing that the city was conducting with itself throughout the early 1970s. All of this was real. None of it was as real, to Harry, as the case file open on his desk, which described a specific situation involving specific people in specific danger from a specific threat that the official machinery was moving toward in its methodical pace and that Harry was moving toward at a different pace, the pace that the specific danger required. The article had called him dangerous. It had been right. It had not understood what made him dangerous, which was not disregard for the people the law was supposed to protect but the specific and sometimes unauthorized willingness to protect them at whatever level the protection actually required, which was sometimes more than the guidelines said and which the guidelines said what they said for reasons that were legitimate in their general application and occasionally, in specific situations, insufficient to the specific urgency of the specific situation in front of him. The article had identified a real quality and misunderstood its source. This was not unusual. Most of what was said publicly about Harry Callahan identified real qualities and misunderstood their sources. The qualities were real. The sources were elsewhere. The elsewhere was not in any file that any journalist had access to, and was not going to be, because the elsewhere was in the specific private accounting of a man who had been doing this for 26 years and who had never once confused the public portrait with the actual picture, and who had organized his entire career around the understanding that the actual picture was the one that mattered, and that the mattering was entirely independent of whether the actual picture was ever visible to anyone but him. The reporter David Marsh covered the San Francisco Police Department for another 3 years before moving to Washington to cover federal policy. In those 3 years he wrote 4 more pieces that touched on Harry Callahan in various ways. A piece about the department's use of force review process that cited Harry's file as an example of the review process's limitations, a piece about a specific case that Harry had closed in a way that attracted attention, a piece about police-community relations in the Tenderloin that included a paragraph about Harry's record of complaints from defense attorneys, and a brief item noting Harry's formal reprimand in connection with the Franklin Cross arson case. Marsh wrote all 4 pieces with the same professional accuracy and the same fundamental incompleteness that had characterized the original article, because he never gained access to the contextual information that would have changed his portrait, and because nobody in the department had ever offered it to him, and because Harry had never spoken to him and never would. The 4 pieces added to the public record a portrait of Harry Callahan that was consistent across its appearances. A detective of unusual effectiveness operating through methods that the department's own guidelines did not sanction and that civil rights organizations correctly found troubling, whose career had been protected by institutional arrangements that were themselves worth scrutinizing. This portrait was not wrong. It was approximately 30% of the truth. The other 70% remained where it had always remained. In the negative space, in the private ledger, in the territory of outcomes that the official record had no mechanism for capturing, in the memory of everyone who had been present in the situations the articles described and understood, from the inside, exactly what the situations had required and why. The Chronicle's archives preserved David Marsh's 4 articles on Harry Callahan alongside thousands of other pieces from the same era, and the articles would remain available, to anyone who looked, as the most extensive public record of what Harry Callahan had been during his career. They were read, occasionally, by people researching the department's history, by civil rights scholars examining patterns of police conduct, by journalism students studying how difficult institutions were to report on from the outside. None of these readers had access to the contextual information that would have complicated the portrait. All of them read a portrait that was internally consistent, professionally produced, and approximately 30% complete. Harry Callahan, who had retired north and was driving somewhere quiet on a Tuesday morning in March, would never read any of these subsequent readings of the articles. He would not know that his name appeared in a Civil Rights Law Review article in 1983 as an example of the department's protection of officers with problematic conduct records. He would not know that a journalism school case study used the Marsh articles as examples of the structural limitations of institutional reporting. He would not know that a retired attorney who had once filed a complaint against him cited his case in a memoir about police accountability. He knew none of this and would know none of it, because he had long since driven away from the city that contained all of it, and because the things he carried with him were not the things the public record contained. What he carried were the cases. The specific and detailed knowledge of what had actually happened in the situations the articles described and in the hundreds of situations the articles had never known about, the knowledge that constituted the actual picture that the newspaper had never been able to print, that was accurate in every particular the newspaper had gotten wrong, and that would remain, permanently and completely, his alone. The danger the Chronicle had identified was real. Harry Callahan was dangerous. He had been dangerous for 26 years, in ways that the newspaper had partially seen and fundamentally misunderstood, and in ways that the newspaper had never seen at all. The danger it had seen, the unauthorized force levels, the strict reports, the pattern of conduct that resisted official accountability, was real, and the concern about it was legitimate, and the journalism that documented it was journalism that needed to exist, because the alternative was a department whose methods went unexamined, and an unexamined department was a different and more dangerous thing than any individual officer's unauthorized conduct. Harry understood this. He had never objected to being reported on. He had objected, internally and without expression, to being reported on incompletely, which was a different objection and one he had never expected to be resolved, because complete reporting on what Harry Callahan actually was would have required a kind of access to the full picture that was never going to be available to any journalist operating through the official channels that journalism had available to it. The danger the newspaper had not seen. The danger of a man who had spent 26 years arriving at situations with the ending already written and who had been right about the ending often enough to have produced, in the aggregate of his career, outcomes that the official record could not fully account for. This danger was real too, and it was larger and more complicated and less troubling in its ultimate direction than the danger the newspaper had identified, and it would never appear in print, and it did not need to. The woman on Clement Street was safe. The warehouse had not burned. Victor Salazar had not resisted in the parking lot and had not gone back. The endings had been written and the endings had held and the city had continued and the newspaper had called him dangerous and they had been right for the wrong reasons and the right reasons were elsewhere and the elsewhere was permanent and sufficient and entirely his own. There is a specific kind of injustice that operates through accuracy, and it is in some ways more difficult to confront than the injustice that operates through falsehood, because falsehood can be corrected and accuracy cannot. The Marsh article was accurate. Its facts were accurate. Its portrait, assembled from those accurate facts, was unjust in a way that no correction of facts could address, because the injustice was not in the facts but in the selection and arrangement of the facts. In the 30% that had been chosen and the 70% that had been omitted, and in the portrait that the 30% produced when assembled in the absence of the 70%. Harry understood this distinction with the clarity of someone who had been living inside it for his entire career. Who had understood, from very early on, that the official record would always be a partial picture of his work and that the partial picture would always produce a portrait that was systematically skewed in the direction of his methods and away from his outcomes, because methods were visible and outcomes were often not, because the methods appeared in reports and the outcomes appeared in the negative space where events that would otherwise have happened had not happened, and the negative space had no column in any official document. The injustice of this was real. It was a form of permanent institutional misrepresentation that operated through the honest application of the documentation process to a form of work that the documentation process was structurally unable to represent honestly. Harry had made his peace with this injustice in the same way he had made his peace with the city's ingratitude. Not by resolving it, which was impossible, but by understanding it so completely that the expectation of resolution had been eliminated, which was the only form of peace available when the thing you were making peace with was structural rather than personal, systemic rather than intentional, permanent rather than correctable. Donnelly had made his peace with it differently. Donnelly's peace was an institutional peace. The peace of a manager who had found a way to maintain a functional working relationship between the official record and the actual reality of what Harry produced, through a combination of careful framing, strategic silences, and the particular institutional skill of knowing exactly which things to put in which drawers and exactly which drawers to not open in which meetings. Donnelly had been doing this for so long that it had become, for him, simply how the work was organized. Not a compromise of his integrity but an expression of it, an understanding that integrity sometimes required absorbing the public cost of an incomplete portrait in order to protect the operational effectiveness of a person whose effectiveness depended on operating in spaces the complete portrait would have closed. He had read the Marsh article with the weary professional recognition of someone watching a predictable thing happen and had responded to it in exactly the way the situation required, which was the minimum necessary acknowledgement combined with the maximum practical protection of the arrangement that the article was threatening. He had succeeded. The article had run. The formal complaints had been noted. No disciplinary action had followed. Harry had continued working. The case file had continued to accumulate. And Donnelly had returned to his window, where the city continued being the city and the Gap continued producing what the Gap always produced, and the arrangement continued for another several years until the retirement papers arrived and Harry signed them in the afternoon before the parking garage and drove north in the March fog. The civil rights organizations that had provided context for the Marsh article were, in the main, organizations doing necessary work in a city that had genuine and documented problems with police conduct that went well beyond Harry Callahan. The targeting of Harry as an example was, from their perspective, reasonable. His file produced the highest ratio of use-of-force complaints to sustained disciplinary actions of any detective in the department's records, which was a pattern that reasonably raised concerns about accountability regardless of what was producing the pattern. They were not wrong to raise the concerns. They were wrong about what was producing the pattern, but their wrongness was not their fault, because the information that would have made them right was not available to them and was never going to be available to them, and the alternative to raising concerns about an accountable pattern on the basis of available information was to not raise concerns about accountability until perfect information was available, which was the same as never raising concerns about accountability, which was exactly what the organizations had correctly identified as the systemic failure they were trying to address. The circular logic of this, that the legitimate concerns about accountability had led to the targeting of the one person in the department whose accountability for outcomes, if that were the correct accounting, was highest, because his use of unauthorized methods had produced the specific results that the accountability framework was supposed to ensure, was not a circle Harry had any interest in explaining to anyone. It was simply the shape the thing had taken, and the shape was not going to change, and explaining it would have required the kind of public account of what he actually did that the arrangement depended on not providing, and so the circle would persist, and the organizations would continue listing Harry's file among their examples, and the examples would remain accurate and incomplete, and the incompleteness would remain permanent and unaddressable, and Harry would continue working until he stopped, and the city would continue receiving what it received, and the newspaper would contain what newspapers contain, which is approximately 30% of what is actually happening at any given time, and the other 70% would remain where most of the actual substance of most things remains, unglamorous, undocumented, present only in the specific and irreducible knowledge of the people who were there. What Harry Callahan had given the Chronicle the opportunity to print, over the years that David Marsh covered the department, was the complete picture. He had not taken it. He had not taken it for several reasons that were all, in their various ways, expressions of the same basic understanding. Taking the opportunity would have required Harry to advocate for himself in a public forum, and advocacy of that kind required either the willingness to expose the full context of his methods, which would have generated consequences for the cases that context involved and for the institutional arrangement that had made his career possible, or the willingness to make claims he couldn't substantiate in the public forum, which was a form of dishonesty Harry was constitutionally incapable of. Beyond the practical constraints, there was the more fundamental fact that Harry did not need the Chronicle to validate what he knew about what he had done. The validation was in the work. The work had produced what it produced. The people who needed to know what it had produced knew what it had produced, knew it not from any article but from the specific and lived experience of having been present in the situations that the articles described and understanding from the inside what the situations had required and why. Harry knew. Donnelly knew. Bressler knew. The people who had been arrested knew, in their own way, from the specific experience of standing across from what the articles could not capture. And the people who had been protected without their knowledge knew in a different way, in the way that consists not of knowledge but of continued existence, of mornings that arrived and coffee that was put on windowsills and lives that continued in their ordinary continuity. This knowing was sufficient. It had always been sufficient. The newspaper had its portrait, and Harry had the work, and the work was the thing that was real, and the portrait was 30% of the thing that was real, and the 30% was the 30% that happened to be visible, and Harry had never once confused the visible with the whole. The danger. Let us return to the danger, because the danger is the word the headline used and the word is accurate and the accuracy is the entire subject. Harry Callahan was dangerous in the specific sense that the Marsh article described, a detective whose methods exceeded authorized parameters, whose documentation of those methods was systematically incomplete, whose career had been shielded from the accountability processes that his conduct by any official measure should have triggered. This danger was real. A city full of officers with Harry's disregard for authorized use of force parameters and Harry's skill at producing reports that did not document the violations would be a more dangerous city in precisely the ways the civil rights organizations were documenting. The framework was correct. The example was wrong because Harry was not, at the level of motivation and outcome that the framework was ultimately about, an example of the thing the framework was describing. He was an example of something else, of the specific and irreducibly individual case that sits at the edge of any framework and challenges the framework not by being outside its legitimate concerns but by being inside its legitimate concerns and also inside something else entirely, something the framework had no mechanism for, something that existed in the negative space of the outcomes the framework was designed to produce. The framework existed to produce safety and justice. Harry Callahan had been producing safety and justice for 26 years through methods the framework could not officially authorize. The framework said he was dangerous. He was dangerous. He was dangerous in the service of exactly the outcomes the framework was designed to produce and exactly the population the framework was designed to protect. The newspaper called him dangerous. They were right for the wrong reasons. And the right reasons were everywhere and invisible and permanent and entirely sufficient and would remain exactly that, everywhere and invisible and permanent and sufficient, for as long as anyone needed them to be, which was to say for as long as the city continued, which was to say indefinitely, which was the only timeline that had ever applied to what Harry Callahan had actually given San Francisco and what San Francisco had never once looked at directly enough to understand. The Thursday morning the article ran was, by every measurable standard, an ordinary Thursday. Harry had read the article over his first coffee and returned to his case file. The case file concerned a series of connected incidents in the Sunset District that the official investigation had been treating as separate and that Harry had concluded were not separate. The conclusion had required 3 days of file work and the specific quality of pattern recognition that 26 years of exactly this kind of work had built in him, and the conclusion was correct, and the work the conclusion required was the work Harry was doing instead of reading the article a second time. The coffee was bad, as the precinct coffee was always bad. The case file was dense, as case files always were. The Thursday was ordinary. The newspaper existed. The portrait existed. Harry existed alongside it, doing the work that the portrait had no mechanism for representing, in the specific and permanent way that things exist when their existence does not depend on being represented, actually, completely, without the need for documentation or acknowledgement or the particular validation that public portraits provide to the people they portray. Harry's existence did not depend on the Chronicle's portrait of it. The Chronicle's portrait was what was available to anyone who looked. Harry's existence was what was available to anyone who had been present, and the people who had been present had what they had, and it was enough, and it had always been enough. And on the Thursday morning in October 1974, when the article ran on page 7, Harry drank his bad coffee and worked his case file, and the city received what it was going to receive from him that day regardless of what appeared on page 7, which was everything the city needed from him and more than the city knew it. Was getting in exactly what the work required and nothing that would appear in any portrait the Chronicle was capable of printing. The newspaper called him dangerous. They were right. The rightness was insufficient. The whole of it was elsewhere.